The PlayStation hummed in the darkness of the living room, its blue glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. Mark and his friend had been gaming for hours, their fingers dancing across controllers as the CRT monitor flickered with each explosion and gunshot. The house felt hollow around them, empty, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. It was summer break, and the protagonist's father had retreated to his bedroom hours ago, leaving the boys to their digital adventures. His mother and siblings were away in the province, making the house feel larger, more isolated than usual. The silence between gaming sessions stretched like a held breath, broken only by their excited chatter about strategies and high scores. Time had slipped away from them like sand through fingers. Neither boy had noticed the gnawing hunger growing in their stomachs until it became impossible to ignore. The protagonist glanced at the old wall clock. 9:30 p.m. His father had already given him money earlier, knowing that neither of them would bother cooking. The decision came naturally. 7-Eleven. Just a quick walk for some steamed bun, cup noodles, and those big bite hot dogs they both loved. The convenience store wasn't far, maybe 8 minutes on foot through their quiet neighborhood. The streetlights created pools of orange light along the sidewalk, and a few locals still lingered outside their homes, chatting in the warm evening air. The boys stepped out into the night, immediately feeling the contrast between the air-conditioned house and the humid Manila air that clung to their skin like a damp cloth. They talked animatedly as they walked, their voices echoing slightly off the concrete walls of nearby houses. Mark was describing a particularly difficult boss fight they'd been struggling with, his hands gesturing wildly as he explained attack patterns and defensive strategies. But as they passed a narrow alleyway shrouded in deeper darkness, something caught the protagonist's peripheral vision. The figure stood motionless in the shadows between two buildings. Even in the dim light, the silhouette was unmistakably feminine. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and she remained perfectly still, like a statue someone had abandoned in the darkness. The protagonist found himself staring, his steps slowing unconsciously as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. The woman, or what appeared to be a woman, didn't move, not even the subtle shifting of weight that living beings do unconsciously. She was frozen, her head cocked to one side in a way that made his stomach clench with unease. "Hey, what are you looking at over there?" Mark's voice cut through his trance. The protagonist blinked, realizing he'd stopped walking entirely. He turned to his friend, then pointed toward the alleyway. "Sir, you see that woman standing?" But when he looked back, the shadow-filled space was empty. His pointing finger aimed at nothing but darkness and the distant outline of garbage bins. The figure had vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving no trace of her presence, except the cold knot of confusion in his chest. "See what? There's nothing there, man." Mark squinted into the alley, then shrugged. "Come on, I'm starving." They continued their journey, stopping briefly at a corner where an old man sold fertilized duck egg from a metal cart, illuminated by a single bare bulb. The vendor's weathered face creased into a smile as they approached, and they each bought one, the warm shell comforting in their palms. The familiar ritual of cracking the egg and savoring the rich, complex flavors helped push the strange sighting to the back of the protagonist's mind. The 7-Eleven glowed like a beacon in the night, its fluorescent lights spilling onto the sidewalk through floor-to-ceiling windows. They were the only customers, and the clerk behind the counter looked up from his magazine with the practiced smile of someone working the late shift. The boys quickly gathered their usual feast, steaming steamed buns, cup noodles, and those oversized hot dogs that had become their gaming fuel. They chose a table by the large windows facing the street, where they could watch the occasional passerby and the fertilized duck egg vendor across the road. The food was hot and satisfying, filling the empty spaces in their stomachs as they planned their return to the PlayStation. Steam rose from their noodles, fogging the window slightly, and they had to wipe it clear with their sleeves to maintain their view of the street. That's when Mark suddenly stopped mid-bite, his chopsticks frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes had locked onto something outside, and the color began draining from his face. "Dude, do you see that?" The protagonist followed his friend's gaze and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. There she was again, the woman from the alley. But now she was directly across the street, standing under a streetlight that somehow seemed dimmer than it should be. Her features were visible now, painted in sickly yellow light. She was pale, unnaturally so, as if all the blood had been drained from her body. Her clothing was a faded green house dress, the kind older Filipino women wore around their homes. But it was her movement that made both boys' appetites disappear completely. Her head was swaying from side to side in a slow, rhythmic motion. Left, then right, then left again. The movement was mechanical, inhuman like a broken toy, repeating the same action endlessly. "She's looking right at us," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the store's air conditioning. The woman's eyes were fixed on the convenience store windows, and through the reflection and fluorescent glare, it seemed as if she was staring directly at them. Her neck, there was something wrong with her neck. The way her head moved suggested it wasn't supporting itself properly, as if the bones and muscles had lost their structural integrity. Mark, ever the joker even in disturbing situations, let out a nervous laugh. "She's crazy, man. Look at her, just swaying back and forth like some kind of mental patient." He started to giggle, the sound high and strained. What a weirdo. But the protagonist couldn't join in the laughter. Something primitive in his brain was screaming warnings, flooding his system with adrenaline. Every instinct told him this wasn't a mentally ill person or a drunk wandering the streets. This was something else entirely. As they finished their meal in uncomfortable silence, the woman's rhythmic swaying visible in their peripheral vision. When they finally decided to head home, the unfinished PlayStation game suddenly seeming less important, they gathered their trash and headed for the exit. The moment they stepped outside, they noticed she had moved. The woman was no longer across the street. Instead, she had somehow crossed over and was now sitting in the narrow space beside the convenience store, tucked into the corner where the building met a low concrete wall. Her head continued its disturbing side-to-side motion, and she seemed completely unaware of their presence, or was pretending not to notice them. Mark's bravado returned as soon as they were outside, the familiar night air seeming to restore his confidence. "Hey, crazy lady," he called out, his voice echoing off the store's walls. "What's wrong with you?" The protagonist grabbed his friend's arm, every nerve in his body telling him to get away from this place, from this woman, from whatever was happening. But Mark shrugged him off, emboldened by what he perceived as harmless oddity. "Maybe she's homeless," the protagonist whispered, trying to rationalize what they were witnessing. "Maybe she's just confused, lost." The street had emptied of its earlier pedestrians, leaving them alone with the swaying figure in the distant fertilized duck egg vendor, who seemed oblivious to their situation. Against every instinct screaming in his head, the protagonist found himself approaching the woman. If she was indeed homeless and hungry, the least he could do was offer her some money. He pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and took careful steps toward her. Up close, Her movement was even more disturbing. The mechanical side-to-side motion of her head never varied in rhythm or intensity. Her eyes stared straight ahead, glassy and unfocused, as if she was looking at something only she could see. As he extended the money toward her, she swayed to the left, and he saw her profile clearly for the first time. His hand froze in mid-air, the bill trembling between his fingers. Her neck. It was bent at an impossible angle. Not just tilted, but broken. The vertebrae clearly separated so that her head hung at a sickening sideways angle that no living person could survive. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't illness or intoxication or mental disturbance. This was death walking among the living. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak, the money falling forgotten to the pavement. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Terror had stolen his voice, leaving him mute as his brain struggled to process what his eyes had witnessed. Mark noticed his friend's sudden retreat and started forward, curiosity overcoming caution. The protagonist grabbed him with desperate strength, pulling him away from the thing that sat beside the store. They stumbled toward the fertilized duck egg vendor's cart, both of them breathing hard, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The old vendor looked up from his cart, immediately noticing their pallor and the wild fear in their eyes. "Boys, what did you see? You look like you've seen a ghost." When they turned back to point out the woman, the corner beside the convenience store was empty. She had vanished again, leaving no trace except the memory of that broken neck and those dead, staring eyes. There was a woman. The protagonist finally managed to whisper. Her neck was broken. The vendor's expression grew grave, and he set down his ladle with a heavy sigh. "I didn't want to tell you this, but what you saw, she's been reported before. A woman was killed in a traffic accident near here. Her neck was broken in the collision." He reached into a small container and pulled out a handful of coarse salt. "Take this. Scatter it behind you as you walk home. It will keep restless spirits from following you." They took the salt with trembling hands and began their journey home, tossing pinches behind them as they walked. But even with the old man's protection, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, a broken-necked woman was still swaying from side to side, waiting for the next pair of late-night wanderers to cross her path. Even now, safe in his bed hours later, he could still see those glassy, lifeless eyes staring through the convenience store window, and her head hanging at that impossible, unnatural angle that would haunt his dreams for years to come.